A lot of you weren't alive to experience this firsthand, but I was. And that is that in the 1970s, cars from our U.S. automakers were severely lacking in quality. They were poorly built. Their reliability was poor. They didn't last. You know, if you made 100,000 miles on a car back in the 70s, you were doing something. Now that's changed, obviously, and U.S. automakers have had a great run. But now, are we returning to the 1970s? Because recalls are way up. And as our U.S. automakers say they're moving toward EVs and phasing out ICE vehicles, things don't seem to be going so well, both from quality and from an economic standpoint. Now, in this very special episode, we're joined by journalist Eric Starkman, who's written extensively about these problems, and we're going to dive into it, find out what the heck is going on and what might happen looking down the road. So stay tuned. We'll fill you in here on Manufacturing Talks.
Welcome to Manufacturing Talks with Jim Vinosky. Industry has a million cool stories, and Jim talks to the movers and shakers who are making them happen. Let's dive in.
Welcome to Manufacturing Talks. I'm Jim Vinosky, your host. We are sponsored by DYS Media, and you're going to be hearing more from them about halfway through the show. But in the meantime, I'm really happy to introduce our guest today. He is not only one of the best journalists working today, he's one of the only journalists working today in reality. Eric Starkman, he is a former journalist himself with major U.S. and Canadian newspapers. He is now author at Starkman Approved. Welcome, Eric. How are you?
Very well. It's an honor to be here.
It's an honor to have you here, sir. It's phenomenal. I've been following Eric's work for, probably a couple of years now, and he just covers stuff that if you're not following him, you've got to, because he covers stuff that happens out there that everyone should know about. Unfortunately, most of it's not good stuff, but that's kind of a true journalist job, right? Is to afflict the comfortable. And Eric does all of that. So Eric, you know, I've learned about you over the couple of years that I've been following you, but I have to say, in preparation for this call, for this show, I did a little more research, and your background is amazing. And so I wanted to start with that. Just have you tell where you came from and how you got to where you are today.
Well, I'm born and raised in Toronto, Canada. I was always a contrarian, even when I was a kid. You know, my mother used to always say to me, "The whole army's out of step but you." And she said that as a question. She didn't say it as a supportive right. Mother, right? You know, boy, you have vision. And, but I was always curious. And my real dream was to be a disc jockey. And I don't know, are you familiar or even old enough to know a radio station? It was in Windsor, but it was a really Detroit powerhouse called CKLW. It was one of the #1 rock and roll stations in the country. And my dream was to be a rock and roll DJ. But in those days, you needed a voice. You used to have those deep voices.
Yeah.
I have a lousy voice, and I'm not sure I got the personality. You know, I'm not the most upbeat guy in the world. It's like, you know, so you have to, you know, my uncle was one of the top DJs in the United States. That's where I got. Wow. Yeah, he worked at a radio station called initially KYW and then WKYC in Cleveland, which was, you know, Cleveland was the home of rock and roll, and he was a 60s DJ.
Yep.
But, you know, when I was in college, I started writing for the student newspaper, and I don't know why I did it. You know, I just, you know, and I couldn't relate to all the people. They were all like Marxists. You know,
yep.
They would send me to things just to almost torment me, like places I didn't belong. But anyhow, I did, you know, I kept doing it. And I don't know why. If you ask me, well, why'd you do it? I don't know. But when I finished undergraduate, you know, I have a liberal arts degree. I wanted to always live in Boston, and they had a graduate school in journalism. And, you know, I look back, I had a lot of chutzpah. You know, drove to Boston, walked in off the street to see. I don't know how I did it. I got to see the dean of the journalism school.
Oh, wow.
And there was something about me that either put him off or wondered if I was for real. And he said, if you really want to be a journalist, we have an admission requirement that, test your knowledge of journalism, where we can see if there's a passion. And you're from Canada, and we're going to have to make allowances for it, but I want you to take the test. But when I was in college, I hated college, but I used to sit and read the Columbia Journalism Review. That used to drive my dad crazy. He said, your exam's not going to have the questions on the Columbia Journalism Review. So I read it and I followed journalism. And when he saw the results of my test, I aced it. Nobody had ever scored that high, and I was Canadian. And that impressed him, and that's how I got in. And a lot of journalists like to knock journalism school, but in those days, I don't think they teach stuff like I was taught. I think they got a whole agenda now. But I really learned from some great journalists, and that gave me a competitive edge. My first job was the Toronto Bureau of the Wall Street Journal, which is where I learned business. I had no interest in business. I don't want to bore your listeners with all my stories, but anyhow, I worked there. But my real dream was to work for the Toronto Star, which was the biggest paper in Canada. It's your hometown paper. And, I imagine you're old enough to remember when people got their news from newspapers.
Oh, yeah.
They were in the box.
Yep.
There was no bigger thrill than walking by the newspaper box in your hometown and seeing your name above the fold.
Oh, yeah.
All those teachers that told me I would never amount to anything. So I worked at the Star, and then I got this, it made no sense. I was a young kid, and I don't know if you've ever been to Montreal.
No, I haven't.
So I got a job offer from Montreal Gazette, which, wasn't a step up professionally, but it was a chance to live in Montreal, and I was young. I took that, but my real dream was to live in the United States. I've always had a fondness for Detroit, and I threw a chance. One of my luck, I've had a lot of luck in life. I had somebody who worked at the Wall Street Journal in Detroit, and he said he knew somebody at the Detroit News, and said, "Want to use my name to get in to see him?" And I did, and I got hired at the News. But then I had to hit some bad luck. Gannett bought it, and I consider Gannett the lowest form of journalism. So then I went into advertising, and then I went back to journalism. I was a senior editor at American Banker, and then I went into PR. And that's pretty much it. And then I ran my own PR firm for 25 years and decided I didn't want to do PR anymore. And I started my blog. I have this idea of wanting to go back and start my own newspaper. That's always been my dream. I came close in Detroit. And my passion, believe it or not, is local news. I don't want to be a national star. I'd rather, a bigger thrill to me would be to, be the editor of the Grand Rapids paper and keep the hospital honest. And what a big fan I am of your local hospital. Yes.
There's all kinds of stories that we could get into on the coverage that I've followed that you've put out there. But what led me to Eric is he's been writing about the auto industry, and specifically because of his love of Detroit and things over here in Michigan. And he now writes from LA. So we're far away from him, but he's been covering very heavily the craziness in the auto industry. So you became an independent journalist, and now you write things that, proper journalists ought to be covering here, and yet they're not. And so, first of all, just the greatest respect to folks like you and, Glenn Greenwald and Barry Weiss, who have seen that mainstream journalism is not doing the job anymore, and you've had the guts to go out on your own and make your own way. And it's really one of the only places to get real news anymore is from independent journalists like you. So thank you for that. But so first of all, tell us how you got interested in the auto industry, and then let's start diving into all this craziness that's happening today.
Well, when I worked at the Detroit News, I was actually intimidated by the auto writers. Like in those days, like, you know, the auto industry was much more powerful and influential, you know, on Michigan in particular.
Sure.
And we had 3 auto writers, and these guys covered the industry like a glove. I mean, I just thought it was too hard for me to understand. And, but I did cover for, you know, the financial side, you know, because I was the banking finance writer. So I had a little taste of it. But, you know, the Michigan thing, you know, my friend ran a publication called Deadline Detroit, and it was a feisty independent paper. So I started writing for him just because, like, he's a great guy, and he's like me. He's fearless. He's you know, he's not afraid to, of a little controversy. So I started writing for him. And I have this theory that, you know, the best CEOs do not want to be written about, you know, and I saw that when I was in PR. You know, I represented a CEO. I'm not going to mention his name, but he orchestrated like one of the few, you know, most mergers don't work, as you probably know. These big mega mergers, they do them and they undo them, and then they spin them off. And but he actually did one that actually worked, and he was amazing. And you know, in those days, journalists, there was this pretty routine story they used to do, was like the CEOs that gave shareholders the biggest bang for the buck, and he was always high up there, right? Like, he was like a natural to get a profile, never, you know. And I saw that in PR, the really good CEOs, they wanted to be judged by their actions and their results. It's not like, I'm great, and here's all the great things I'm going to do. And what I noticed is the ones who shout the loudest are the ones that deliver the least. And, you know, so when I was writing for Deadline Detroit, there was this real puff piece. I mean, I've read a lot of puff pieces, but this one was over the top, about Jim Farley at Ford. I mean, this was like a schmutz, what's the word? Schmutzer, or anyhow, it was a big, there's another word which I won't use on your on your show, but this one was it was over the top, you know, like, and you could see that the PR people had teed this reporter up, like, you know, she talked to the head of marketing and was saying, you know, hearing Jim at a meeting, it's like a religious thing. It was like, it was over the top. And then, you know, the Free Press did one on Mary Barra, and that was just over the top. And, you know, one of the things that I'm proud of in terms of my intuition is, like, it was over a year and a half ago, I did a column for Deadline Detroit called Why I'm Skeptical of Jim Farley and Mary Barra. So the more they talked, the less I was impressed. And, you know, I just started learning the industry. And, you know, I come across as arrogant, but I'm actually, like, really insecure. So a lot of times I'll read things and I'll think I'm just too dumb. You know, this doesn't make sense to me. Like, well, how can these Wall Street analysts? I mean, they're analysts. They must be way smarter than me, and they don't see it. But over time, it just became more obvious to me, and that how can these people? They can't make ICE cars, and they've had 100 years to do that. Right. And all of a sudden, they're going to make electric cars, you know, and it's just like, you know, my dad always said, there's no substitute for experience. Yep. You know, the experience counts, and Tesla's been doing it for 20 years.
Right.
And
and that's a big piece of what caught my eye with your work about the auto industry, was that you were calling out the realities of today, where there's just, like you say, all these puff pieces out there talking about these brilliant CEOs who've set the major automakers on this path to be all EV by 2035 or whenever it is. And so I started reading your stuff about the realities. I actually pulled up some data here because you write about their recalls all the time. And so in 2022, Ford had 67 recalls affecting over 8.5 million vehicles. Stellantis had 38 recalls for over 3 million vehicles, and General Motors had 32 recalls for almost 3.4 million vehicles. And so by vehicles, they are far and away the top three. Number of recalls, you have Volkswagen's number 2, and Mercedes-Benz is number 4, but their numbers are, both of them, around 1 million vehicles apiece. So on sheer numbers of affected vehicles, it's just insanity. And so, that's what I started noticing is, I'm an engineer and I've never worked in auto, but I've worked in manufacturing, as you know, for a long, long time. And we're promising this step up to a whole new, more difficult level of technology, and they can't do their day-to-day job today.
So, Jim, this is how bad things are. They are now doing recalls. Ford is doing recalls on recalls. I don't know if you saw this, but this is one for this is one for the ages. It was like on their Ford Ranger, where they hired, where it was something with the airbags, and they obviously hired a third party to do the recall, and the third party didn't do it right. And according to the notes with the National Highway Transportation Safety Commission, is that the company they hired to do the recall didn't read the instructions that came with.
Oh, geez.
To replace the airbags, and now they got to go back in and replace them again.
Oh, geez.
That is too much.
Yeah. Like you say, kind of where we're at, just bottom of the barrel here. Well, we're going to take a moment here to hear from our sponsor, DYS Media. We'll be right back.
DYS Media, your digital media relations agency. Public relations, website design, digital marketing. You get found by the customers and talent who need your solutions. You get media placements in top publications, the best job candidates coming to your website, a digital presence that gets you found by the right people. Call 616-298-8798 to get started today.
Thank you, DYS Media, for sponsoring the show. We're back with Eric Starkman. He is an independent journalist at Starkman Approved, a longtime real journalist and one of the best ones writing today. Eric, thank you for being here, and let's jump back in.
One thing I've learned, I always read reader comments, because often you learn more from the reader comments than you do the actual story that the reporter wrote. So I'm always reading the reader comments on Detroit Free Press and Detroit News Stories, because in all likelihood, these people work at the auto companies. And what I've learned from reading these comments is that Ford wanted to cut their pension costs and forced out their most experienced engineers, thinking, hey, we don't have to pay these guys big bucks. We can get some kid in India to do some of our designs for us. And that's what they did. They've been outsourcing jobs. They moved a lot. Initially it was just the building of cars to Mexico, but they're doing design. I found a video of the head of Mexico's, I think he was the head of Mexico operating. He was a senior Ford guy anyhow, talking about all the design and manufacturing going on in Mexico. And I think they have possibly reached the point of no return. I mean, you look at, I posted something. I wish I should have thought of it, because maybe we could have shown it on your video. There's this guy, if you don't watch him, you should. His name's Scotty Kilmer. He's like a salt of the earth mechanic. He's been around, he's like I think he said his bio said he's been a mechanic for 50 years. And, you know, this guy knows cars.
Yep.
And he's been warning about Ford for quite some time, but he just did a video. I'm blanking on the name, but Ford makes, I can't believe they make a pickup that starts at $109,000 a year, but that's what he said. He said, you know, and he like had all these reports, like oil's leaking, like just the shoddy workmanship of how this stuff was put together. This vehicle was put together.
Mm-hmm.
It's a $109,000 vehicle, and it was a 2023. And Farley was brought in 2 years ago to improve quality. And from what I see, it's getting worse. You know, some of the recalls on the Bronco and you know, the electric Mustang, that's gone. You know, and last year it was like 6 recalls, and you know, some of the recalls, like the EV guys like to say, well, they're not really recalls because we can fix them, you know, over the air, but there's still defects that have to be corrected. But
right.
The Mustang, you know, the electric, they had their dealer, you know, you got to take it to a dealer. I always laugh when people say, you know, I don't want these dealers anymore. I want to deal direct with the company. Like, what do you think you're going to take the car?
Back to Detroit or to Mexico.
Yeah, you'll drive it to Mexico. And people just don't think. And it's like, you know, it's actually pretty scary. And I got to share this with you because I just found it this morning before the show. And I'll lament it if I didn't mention it. So, you familiar with Elon Musk's yokes, like the toy steering wheel that they put on the?
Oh, yep.
You know, my cousin has a Model S. You know, the top of the line. Well, I think the Plaid. I can't keep track of all their letters, but it's you know, he paid $109,000 for it, and it has the yoke. And I'm always teasing him. He said, "You got a toy steering wheel," and I have to imagine there was a great class. I mean, you know, you forgot more about manufacturing than I'll ever know, but it seems logical, doesn't it, that if it's half a steering wheel, that the cost would be lower, no? Because you need less material to make the steering wheel. Am I correct? So they put in this yoke, and people hate it. So they recently introduced an accessory for which they're charging $700 to replace the steering wheel that they shouldn't have put on in the first place. And you would think that would be done for free. Like, okay, we realize you hate it, but they're charging $700, and they sold out in a matter of days.
Holy cow!
You know, that's how much people hated the steering wheel, and it's insanity. And that's what scares me. You know, when I was a kid growing up, you know, my memory of my parents and their friends, they were always picking each other up to work because their cars were in the shop. I don't know. That was a common phrase in Canada. I'm not sure if it's the same here in the States. My car's in the shop. And that was considered the natural order of things, that you bought a car, you took it back to the dealer like once a month, and there was something wrong, and then they would sell you something else. You know, I'll never forget those days when I had the Chevy Citation. Are you familiar with that vehicle?
Yep.
I would take it into the dealership, right, to get fixed, and for an oil change. And without fail, I would get a call. You know, Mr. Starkman, it's Jim over at D. Meyer Chevrolet. How are you today? And I knew this call was
getting worse by the second, right?
and he would say to me, while we were doing your oil change, we noticed you needed a new thermomajig. And we recommend that you replace the thermomajig. And I go, well, how much is the thermomajig? You go, well, the thermomajig itself is only $2. But in order to get to the thermomajig, we have to take apart your engine.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because when I'll do an intro short clip to put at the front of this video, and it will talk about how I'm feeling like our quality on our ICE cars today in the U.S. Automakers is returning to the 70s. There's so many recalls and so many things going wrong. And we had a good stretch there, right? We were starting to almost challenge the Japanese automakers in quality there for a while, and it's just gone completely the other way in the last, 5 years or so.
I can't talk with authority because once I switched to Japanese vehicles, I became a loyalist. I drove, my first Japanese car was the Toyota Celica.
Mm-hmm.
What a wonderful car that was. And I drove the Celica, a couple of those, and then I switched to what's the SUV? Something runner. What's it called?
4Runner.
4Runner or something like that.
Yep.
I drove those amazing vehicles, and Toyota always did right for me. I can tell you just a great story about Toyota. I don't know if they'd still do this today, but you might find this interesting. So I'm a radio buff.
Mm-hmm.
And so when my first Celica, I loved it. And I lived in Detroit and I put a ton of miles on it in 2 years. And so I wanted to trade it in before it had too many miles on it, and then I couldn't get anything for it. So the next Toyota I got, I used to have, the scan on your radio that it would pick up the next, all your local stations. Yep. So I noticed it was skipping one of the stations that I listened to,
mm-hmm.
which told me that the antenna wasn't as good as my old Celica. So I called the dealer, and they're just kind of looking at me. This is some odd guy. They brought in a regional guy from Toyota. I mean, I love this story. And I told him, I can tell you, downgraded the antenna, and I, bought the car on good faith. And the guy admitted to me, he said, we did downgrade the antenna. We used a different kind of antenna. But of all the hundreds of thousands of people who bought the car, you're the only one who complained. But you know what they did for me? They took out the rear window. They got me the old antenna from a Supra. They still made it a more expensive car. And they were willing to swap it out for me just to keep me happy.
Mm-hmm.
And, I read about how Tesla nickel and dimes their customers, but I was diehard loyal to Toyota for a good 15 years, and I switched to Acura because of a great salesman that I miss the old days of a great car salesman.
Yeah,
people like to badmouth salesmen, and I think there's a lot more legitimacy today. When I went to a dealer once and I asked some young kid about a car, and the old car guys, you walk into a dealer and you just walked in and they were ready to sell you cars. And it's changed, but I always my dad had a loyalty to his dealership and to the manager of the dealer. And I ultimately ended up buying from that guy when I got older. So it's changed, and it's not changed for the better.
No, and it's interesting. You hear these stories now about the EVs and how they're selling subscriptions for particular things to work. Have you heard that one? So I saw one where one of the automakers backed off, and this was not an American automaker, so I'm going to be fair, but there was an automaker that was going to sell subscription to the anti-lock braking system. So you'd have to pay monthly to actually have that work. And again, they backed off when they got a bunch of bad press, but that's unfortunately where we're headed with the higher technology and all the subscription stuff. So the U.S. automakers they've declared that they're going to be EV producers, and they're busy building the last of this ICE and that ICE model, spending billions of dollars on all the tooling of the new models and all the plants that have to make them like the Chinese plant that we're going to put in here in Michigan at taxpayer cost, send a bunch of money to our political adversaries over on the other side of the world. And yet, so Ford announced this week that they've lost another $3 billion last year on EVs. And you mentioned earlier, you think they may be at the point of no return. You know, how can they turn this around? They're not making good ICE vehicles. EV vehicles are a step above that in technological difficulty, and they're losing their shirts already.
Well,
how do you dig out of that?
Well, I think it's even more dire than that. And here I go again, being Mr. Negative.
You're going to one-up me on negativity.
I can't help it. It's like a disease, you know? Here's why I think it's like things are really dire, right? So yeah. I'm going from numbers, but, you know, they're losing $3 billion. And they said that by 2025, they hope to earn an 8% profit margin, which still won't be the 10% margin for the entire company, which means they're still going to be making more money selling their gas guzzling, you know, trucks and SUVs. That's till 2025 just to get an 8% profit margin. Well, Tesla's already got, I think it's a 16% profit margin. And, you know, look, you got to take anything Elon Musk says with a grain of salt. But he did say that he can, they're confident that they can cut their manufacturing costs in half. And I read up on that, like some of these people, like esoteric bloggers that like, to really understand this stuff, and they said it's actually possible for him to do that. I sent you a link to one of those guys.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, he seemed credible. I mean, again, you forgot more about manufacturing than I know, but he struck me as credible, and he made the argument like, here's why Musk can cut his costs and GM and Ford can't. That you know, he built his factories from the ground up to be electric factories. And, you know, I can't do justice to it. But why would anybody want to invest in a company that says in 2025, I hope to be earning half the operating margin that Elon Musk is earning now? It's like, I read that and it's like, I don't get it. You know, it's like that guy made me an argument why Jim Farley should be fired. And the guy said on one of his investor calls, Farley, he said, you know, we left $2 billion on the table last year. Could you imagine going to one of your clients and saying, you know what, all that work I did for you, I left $2 billion on the table because I really didn't understand what I was doing. They wouldn't be your client anymore.
Right.
Like the insanity of the world today. The guy could say that, and his stock price is down, and it's like, oh, that sounds right to me. You know, it's
Well, and then you know, we got the announcement from GM after they had already announced they were laying off 500 people. That now they're offering buyout packages to anyone with over 5 years. I think it was. And you mentioned earlier how Ford had gone through that whole exercise of trying to whittle down their pension costs. And so it's just interesting to me that they're saying all these things about being these superstars of the bright future of EVs and taking on that technical challenge. And here you're going to let your best and brightest at GM go out the door.
Well, you know, there's another element to this story that I haven't seen discussed very much. And I'd welcome, you know, tell me like, Eric, I think you're off the mark here. But I just saw a story about how GM's market share in China went from like 16% to 9%. And I'm not an authority on China, but I have been reading up about how they got into electric vehicles and their transitions to it.
Yep.
And, you know, China didn't get into electric vehicles because they care about the climate.
No.
It had nothing to take. They're still building coal plants there.
Exactly.
Their governor just shut down a nuclear plant.
Oh, geez, don't
they're,
get me
they're
started.
building, they understand you need a grid to run these cars. I mean,
and to have manufacturing.
So, they just realized in the 90s that they couldn't compete on the global stage with, Mercedes and BMW, that nobody was going to ever buy a Chinese car. That they couldn't compete on ICE vehicles. But to their credit, they identified electric vehicles as an area where they could gain an edge.
Yeah. Do the little cost version.
They started buying up all the material. I mean, I got to tell you, China's leadership is scary, wicked, smart. I mean, what these guys did, bought up, and with the help of our president's son, got one of the nickel, got control of major nickel deposits. But they cornered the market on the supply chain.
Yep.
But they didn't go from... They had the smarts to say you can't just build electric vehicles overnight. And what's a company called? Warren Buffett actually invested in it. I think it's BYD. It's one of there's so many letters in my head. I can't. But it's a Chinese company.
Yeah.
It's Tesla's major competitor. But they didn't start off as an electric company. They started off making ICE vehicles. And they gradually they went down. They did exactly what Toyota's former CEO said. You had to have a transition stage. Right. You had to master the hybrid, and then you could master the electric vehicle.
Yep.
And that's exactly what not Maserati. What's in Italy? The one of the big great car companies.
Fiat.
No, not Fiat.
Italy.
I'm having this.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, but they're known for the best cars in the world, and the Morgan Stanley analyst that used to be really bullish on Tesla. His top automotive pick now is that company.
Oh wow! Well, and it's interesting as we talk about the 70s, because you think what happened back then when the oil shocks hit and American companies were not only producing bad quality, they're also producing all the muscle cars and the big, huge land yachts. And Japan came over here with their small, gas efficient cars and just ate our lunch. And so it's almost a replay, of that scenario too, where right now all these automakers are putting out these EVs that are just top end, and there's no ordinary Joes buying the $70,000 and $80,000 or $150,000 or $200,000 EVs. People aren't buying them for their daily driver to get to the manufacturing plants. But if this company from China comes over here and has a $30,000, $40,000 EV, guess what? We get our lunch eaten again.
And that's what they're going to do.
Yeah.
And you know who they owe a lot of thanks to for helping master electric vehicles? Elon Musk.
Yeah.
The brilliance of what they did is amazing. They don't let anybody, GM can't go in. They got to go in with a partner. But they let Tesla go in on their own. But they had to agree to, only buy from Chinese manufacturers, and they had to help nurture the industry. And, you'll never hear Elon Musk say a bad word about China.
Yep.
No.
Well, and I'm no fan of China's government, but they're playing to win. And no one in our government is. Most of our major corporate leaders aren't, and trust me, I'm an outdoorsman. I love the environment, and I think we should be protecting it as best we can. But we got all these people on the bandwagon of electrifying everything and fighting global warming, and they're not looking at, geez, what does it take to do that while being a successful company, while having reliable energy and energy that is at a price where we can compete with our manufacturing. And, that's another place that like you, I'm not real bullish on our direction, and I'm banging the drum that manufacturers need to take care of business first. Yeah, we can do all this environmental stuff and take care of our people along the way, but if we're not winning at business, we're not going to be here to do any of that.
And we're not winning at business.
No, we're not. And I mean, that's why I had you on, because what you showed me, obviously I know a little something from just being here in Michigan and being in manufacturing, that there were problems with the car makers, but all the highlighting you did of the repeat recalls, and then these crazy moves around moving toward EVs and just not getting the job done. It's pretty scary.
You sound like me now.
Well, as we talked before we got on, there are lots of great stories out there. I would hate to see our domestic automakers go away, and I don't think they will, because I think, as I predicted on LinkedIn yesterday, they'll be back at the government trough in 2 to 3 years, getting bailed out because they're too big to fail. But it won't make them any better at business when that happens. And so then we have another set of zombie companies, a whole other problem. But I'll keep writing about the good manufacturers and try to boost both of our spirits.
I always thought it'd be great if we could switch places for a week. I'll tell you the stories I'm planning on writing, and you tell me the stories you're planning on writing, and then we switch. I write your stories, and you write mine.
Well, we got to wrap up here. So Starkman Approved, that is your Substack?
No, it's actually my own.
I'm sorry. Your own site. People will find you at Starkman Approved. Folks, you got to be following Eric Starkman. It is a downer, a lot of what he writes about, but we got to know what's going on, and we need to be challenging and pushing back on some of these dumb decisions that people are making, whether it's in the government world or the business world, because it's affecting all of us. And Eric, thank you for pulling back the curtain and showing us that. Keep up the great work, and I'll be sending people your way to read your stuff.
Well, thanks for all the support. Really appreciate it.
Glad to. And everyone, thank you for joining us on Manufacturing Talks. I'll see you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to Manufacturing Talks with Jim Vinosky. Watch for new episodes dropping on the first and third Tuesdays of every month.